The amount of information available to any given human on planet Earth is staggering. Some of this information is based on facts, others based on partial facts, others based on statements of ignorance, and others based on lies. Some have said that they are absolutely sure that absolute truths do not exist. But what does the Bible say? Dendrochronology is the science that assigns accurate calendar dates to the yearly growth rings produced by trees. Archaeologists have used this accurate and sophisticated dating method for nearly a century.
The tree ring dating, I just want to point out, is certainly not an exact science. But the oldest one they've counted clearly and pretty certainly is 4,300 rings. Assumption is 4,300 years. It's that at a maximum, probably less than that as far as
the Bible says. There was a global flood around 4,500 years ago. Now, it's pretty hard to get a tree growing during a global flood, so I had to start growing sometime after the flood to 4,500 years old. Should be the oldest age for any living tree that there is on the planet, and it is.
The tree is 4,300 years old. Now, you need to understand, tree ring dating is not an exact science. Trees, the rings on a tree do not indicate summer, winter, summer, winter. They can indicate lots of rain, no rain, lots of rain, no rain.
Looking at a reconstruction of this floating forest from the outside edge with short little plants that require water to taller and taller plants, including trees, in the center of the floating forest on the pre-flood oceans. So this developed into the floating forest theory, the proposition that before the flood, these plants were actually arranged in a floating forest on the world's oceans. Just take these plants and put them up here. This is an artist's reconstruction of what the floating forest would look like from the outside edge to the middle. But in the flood, especially when this might get towards the land, when those waves would break and start ripping this forest apart, that it would tend to rip the outside edge of the forest first and then work its way into the middle. Here all we see are the short plants. They would be out here towards the edge, but these are in the center of the floating forest. So these would be out in the forest regions of our forest. So you go into a museum and see the dioramas through time. You're not looking at dioramas through time. You're looking at dioramas of the floating forest from the outside to the inside.
So the way that this theory works is God created the world as a floating forest, okay, on top of a large amount of water, okay, and then underneath the water obviously is dirt and rock, basalt like it is today, and underneath that is the crust of the earth going down for hundreds of miles until you get to the mantle. Okay, but in between the mantle and the crust of the earth, there is subterranean chambers of water. At the time of the flood, the water that is under the crust of the earth comes up, okay, through a giant crack that opens up a hole which stretches across the earth like the seam of a baseball, opens up and allows all this water, all the subterranean waters are released. Water is coming up under the earth, and with it, it's bringing up tons and tons of sediment, which will cover this forest, starting from the swamps to the forest to the highlands, covering the earth as the floodwaters rise.
So the floating forest theory explains the increase in size of plants in the fossil record, the increase in terrestriality of plants in the fossil record. A floating forest might be created by God, and it would be stable as a floating forest. But once it's destroyed by the flood, it's never probably ever going to reproduce itself. It's never going to be able to recreate that forest it did before the flood, because the waves of the ocean would break it up too fast. That would explain why most of the plants are actually extinct in the present.
This article says that a 3,375-year-old log could be the climate change solution we've been waiting for. The tree stores carbon and then releases carbon when it dies, but this tree has released very little carbon, so they're studying it for a way to be able to absorb the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere with trees. The way that they came to that age is by dendrochronology, the study of measuring tree rings in yearly increments. But scientists will say that the global flood didn't happen, but that they have dates from dendrochronology that extend to an age that's farther back than 4,500 years. As we'll see, these tree ring dating methods are not an exact science, and there are many flaws which can subject them to other hypotheses that may be able to better explain the information in the tree ring.
You might not realize that there's a library of information in those trees. Each tree is recording information about the environment that it's growing in. The main focus of my work right now is to try to reconstruct stream flow from tree rings. The process is dendrochronology, so dendro for tree and chronology for time. We primarily take very small core samples. They're about the diameter of a pencil with a hand drill, and then we take it back to the lab. By cross-dating the rings in this dead tree with living trees, we'll be able to identify when this tree died. Then we follow that up by measuring the rings to 1,000th of a millimeter, so it's very detailed work. When we have droughts, the rings are very narrow, and the more extreme, the narrower the ring. As we're trying to identify patterns in wide and narrow rings, you can kind of think of that as a barcode in the food that you might buy in the store. Trees in an area are going to have not exactly the same pattern, but a similar pattern of wide and narrow rings, just like that barcode. We get to the point where we could just look across a sample and say, okay, there's 1580 and there's 1735. We know where those difficult years are. We're able to look at the records in the rings, and from that reconstruct stream flow much further back than we can just with historical records.
See, they aren't annual rings. So tree ring dating is a far cry from an exact science, especially with these trees because they're such a gnarled mess. I mean, they kind of grow this way a while, and then they grow this way a while, and it's just not a simple science for counting these. And they have to count the rings under a microscope because these trees grow about an inch in 100 years. So in an inch, you've got 100 rings to count. Some will say, well, by overlapping tree ring dating with tree stumps and logs found in Indian dwellings and stuff like this, the ancient cliff dwellings, they overlap these tree ring and they get a tree ring sequence that goes back 8,000 years. Well, this is real questionable because tree ring dating, first, is not an exact science. Secondly, two trees can grow side by side and have very different ring pattern. If there's a big tree and a little tree, the big one gets all the sunlight, the little one doesn't get any. One day the big one dies, now the little one gets all the sunlight, so his growth pattern is much different. You can have two trees on opposite sides of the same mountain getting different amounts of rainfall because when air goes up, it drops all of its water. When it comes down the mountain, it absorbs water. That's called the rain shadow in Washington State. One side of the mountains is loaded with trees. As soon as you get over the top, it's basically desert.
In some areas, under the best conditions with the best species, we can have up to a 10,000 year record from tree rings. We have maybe 50 to 100 years of historical records for the rivers around here, but we have trees that can go back several hundred years. If you look at the Weber River, we have about 100 years of record. So that gives us a rough idea of how long droughts have been and how severe they've been, but it's only 100 years of record.
Although the dating method can get you pretty close to the time that the tree was born, it is not an exact science. There are false rings where some years have multiple rings, which can lead to inaccurate counts because of the fact that multiple tree rings can grow under different conditions of more sunlight, less sunlight, more rain, less rain. Not every sample of wood can be dated using this method, and dendrochronology only dates the rings in the wood sample, not the entire tree. The margin of error for dating living trees increases with the age of the tree.
Tree ring sequences, where they find a tree that has several rings, they look at the ring pattern where they're kind of close, and then they're far apart, then they're kind of close for several years, and then far apart for a few years. They would consider these to be the good years when it got lots of rain. These would be the bad years when it didn't get much rain. Then they find another log someplace else, and they try to line it up. So they got good years, bad years, good years, bad years, and this one will extend farther, and this one will extend farther this way. And so they've stretched their overlapping tree ring dating to, I don't know what the number is, probably close to 6,000 years. But this would be based on all sorts of very obvious assumptions, and it wouldn't hold up 2 seconds in a court of law. The problem is it doesn't have to hold up in a court of law. It just has to be taught in school. You just have to convince the kids of it. That's where the problem comes in right there.
Cross-dating allows researchers to place sequences in time by matching patterns securely. The placement of these sequences in time is guided by the underlying assumption of a single growth ring per year and continuous growth over now buried trees. The pattern of rings of living trees are compared to those of the dead trees that are fossilized or buried underneath the living trees. So if you compare the rings of the living trees and the dead trees that are buried beneath them, this gives scientists a hypothetical series of rings, some thin and some thick, that go back thousands of years.
So the oldest living tree is 4,300 years old. Now the creationist solution to this is very simple. There was a flood 4,400 years ago that destroyed the world, and it would have wiped out everything. However, many trees can be uprooted, float around in a flood, and land, and start growing again. Don't they transplant bushes and trees all the time? So in a flood situation, Noah was in the ark for over a year. That does not mean every square inch of the world was flooded for an entire year. It just means all we know is Noah was in the ark for a year. Certain sections of ground might have only been underwater for a month. The crust of the earth would be lifting and sinking, and there would be shuffling and water sliding back and forth, carrying sediments with it, lots of mud layers being laid down during this flood. Now, if you have floating log mats of stuff floating around that's been uprooted and drifting around, the seeds, of course, are going to be able to survive soaked in this water for a short time and then regerminate.
Visually cross-matching similar patterns and specific growth rings from living trees and the dead trees beneath them, sample to sample, is highly subjective. There could be major variations from tree to tree in a forest in the same area. If you can predict a certain environmental catastrophe in the past or a certain drought that happened in a certain year based off of tree rings, you could use that as data that's based on factual, observable, testable, demonstrable information. But if you're looking at a tree and you have no idea what the environment was at that time, then you can't then use that and compare it to the living tree and establish a sequence of events that goes back for hundreds and thousands of years. Okay, that there you're getting one tree ring every year. You can't be confident of that if you don't know what the environment was like. Even though you can get pretty close to, the date of a historical event, if you go, the farther back in the past that you go, the older the tree is, the harder that it is to be able to tell what's going on in the past and what the tree rings are showing. There is a seagrass meadow 10 miles long near Spain, and it's estimated to be 200,000 years old, considered the oldest known single organism on the Earth. So maybe we can explain the dendrochronology results from a biblical perspective, but what about other things like the seagrass meadow that's supposed to be 200,000 years old when the Bible says that the entire universe is less than 7,000 years old? Scientists have calculated the age of Posidonia oceanic plants in the Mediterranean to thousands or tens of thousands of years old. The meadow in Spain is between 80 to 200,000 years old, making it the oldest living organism on the Earth. The growth rate of seagrass, even under the best conditions, is about 10 to 15 centimeters per year. And that is an average of 100 years for 1 square meter of this seagrass to grow. Most seagrass grows in depths of 3 to 9 feet, while some have been found up to 190 feet of depths. And they grow best in the tropical regions where the water is warmer. And even under the best conditions, 100 years for 1 square meter of the seagrass to grow. Using the current growth rate of seagrass, an expanse that stretches 15 kilometers would consist of clones dating back to 200,000 years. About 78 degrees Fahrenheit would be the equivalent to the temperature that these seagrass grow best in. The temperature of the water can have a number of effects on seagrass, including altered growth rates, distribution shifts, and changes in sexual reproduction patterns. For the seagrass to be up to 200,000 years old, the seagrasses would have had to live through dramatic swings in sea level and salinity caused by ice ages that are assumed to have happened in the past several times. Since they live in shallow water, they are now living on what was dry land a mere 10,000 years ago.
According to conventional geological wisdom, there was an ice age 10,000 years ago. Now, if the seagrass are 200,000 years old, that doesn't make any sense, because they would have had to be consisting of a current growth rate, okay, which is based on them living in the water over a certain period of time, okay, so 200,000 years of growth based on the current rate. But if they were totally not underwater 10,000 years ago when the sea levels were lower and there was more ice, then you have a problem with the growth rate. You can't assume that the growth rate has always been the same if you acknowledge that 10,000 years ago they would have been on land. There would have been totally different conditions. Another hypothesis to explain the size of these seagrass meadows is for an original clump of plants before the global flood, which seems to make sense with billions of dead things buried all over the world and rocks laid down by water. You have an original clump of plants transported by waves, okay, and these plant fragments can drift to other locations during the flood, put down their roots, and begin to grow again. So what you see, on the earth, these giant seagrass meadows could be a part of an ancient forest biomass underwater that existed in entirely different conditions before the global flood, assuming that conditions were different before and after the flood. A growth rate of 1 to 6 centimeters per year for this seagrass does not extend past the Ice Age in several locations. So to determine that it's been the same for some seagrass in another location that wouldn't be affected by the Ice Age, it could still be affected by other environmental factors in the area that aren't necessarily known about, or the research that's being done on these seagrass meadows as far as their growth rate. Maybe they're not studying enough of the meadow. They're just focusing on one locality and then assuming that the entire meadow is growing at the same rate. The Archean, Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic are not different time periods, but different phases of one catastrophic event, a global flood in the days of Noah approximately 4,500 years ago, and this progressively buried the earth from the bottom of the ocean floor to the highest mountains, and in doing so, catastrophically buries and preserves the remains of those creatures that lived at those altitudes. So we're looking at an order of creatures based on altitude above sea level that they live in. As the floodwaters rise, covering those ecosystems with dirt and rock, which has cementing agents in it that are coming from deep within that area in the subterranean chambers, and the ceiling becomes covered with these cementing agents because the ceiling and the floor are both dissolved from the water in those subterranean chambers, because it reaches a supercritical point called supercritical water far beyond the point of boiling, which is what caused all of that water to be released in the first place. All of those minerals will then come up to the surface, burying these previous ecosystems, and be used as cementing agents to turn everything into rock. Trees growing everywhere on that forest, and that explains the massive coal beds. More coal in the earth than there is trees available on the earth right now to produce it, meaning that if you took all the trees on the earth today and you cut them down and you produced coal out of it, it would not even come close to the amount of coal that there is in the earth right now. And this is because before the flood, the earth was mostly landmass with very small oceans. Everything was quickly buried, and even the sediment itself, like the clay and the silt and the sand and the soil, with the wave action, hydrologic sorting, liquefaction, where small minerals rise to the surface, heavy minerals come down. So the wave action pulverizes previous ecosystems and redeposits them into new layers by hydrologic sorting and liquefaction and other processes of the waves, which with no continents to interrupt the tidal waves are over 300 feet tall. As the moving of the water goes back and forth and it sorts everything into layers, the reason the fossils are in the order that they are is because of where they live.